Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of the drawing room, while her mother's words cut through the warm evening air like a blade through silk. 28 years old, Mrs. Ashworth said, not even lowering her voice, and still no husband. What will people think of this family? The room went quiet for a moment, and every eye turned toward Eleanor. She kept her chin steady and her hands folded in front of her, though her heart pounded hard against her ribs. This was not the first time. It would not be the last. Her younger sister Margaret laughed softly behind her fan. Perhaps she prefers her books to a husband, mother. Some women simply are not meant for marriage. Charlotte, the middle sister, joined in with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Or perhaps no man wants a woman who has grown too old to be chosen. Eleanor felt the sting of every word, but she did not let it show. She had learned long ago that tears only fed their amusement. Instead, she lifted her eyes and looked calmly at her sisters, one by one. "I am well, thank you for your concern," she said, her voice steady. "I do not need a husband to prove my worth." Louisa, the youngest of the three married sisters, rolled her eyes. That is easy to say when no one has offered. The laughter that followed was soft, cruel, and familiar. Eleanor turned away and walked toward the window, where the last light of the evening painted the garden in gold and shadow. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and took a slow breath. She had heard this same conversation more times than she could count. At every family dinner, every tea, every gathering of relatives, someone would find a way to remind her that she was the one sister left unmarried. The one sister who had failed. The one sister whose chances, they believed, had long since run out. What none of them knew was the truth she carried inside her, a truth she had never spoken aloud in 10 long years. Behind her, the conversation moved on to other matters, as it always did once they had taken their turn wounding her. Mrs. Ashworth began speaking of the upcoming season, of new gowns and new introductions for Louis's sister-in-law, of which young men from good families might still be available. Eleanor listened without listening, her mind drifting far from the room, back to a summer she had tried for years to forget. She had been 18 then, full of hope and quiet joy. She remembered laughter in a garden not unlike the one outside this very window. She remembered a young man with serious gray eyes and a gentle way of speaking, who had once told her that he saw more in her than anyone else ever had. She remembered believing him completely. Then without warning he was gone. No letter, no farewell, only silence that stretched on until she stopped waiting for it to end. She had never told her family what happened. It was easier to let them believe she simply had not tried hard enough, that she had let her chances slip away through carelessness or pride. The truth was far more painful, and far more confusing, and she had buried it so deep that even she sometimes wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. But she had not imagined it. She knew that for certain, because she still remembered the exact color of his eyes, the sound of his voice when he laughed, and the particular way he used to say her name, as though it were something precious. "Eleanor," her mother called from across the room, pulling her back to the present. "Come and sit. We are discussing the invitation that arrived this morning." Eleanor turned from the window, arranging her expression into something calm and pleasant. "An invitation, mother." "Yes, and a very important one." Mrs. Ashworth held up a cream-colored card with elegant gold lettering, waving it as though it were a prize she had personally won. "We have been invited to the ball at Dunhollow Hall." The name struck Eleanor like a sudden gust of cold wind, though she gave no outward sign of it. She kept her face still, her hands folded, and asked in a level voice, "Dunhollow Hall." "The Duke of Dunhollow," Margaret said, practically bouncing with excitement. "One of the wealthiest and most respected men in the country, and famously private. He almost never hosts events, yet somehow our family has been invited." "It is through your husband's connections, of course," Mrs. Ashworth said to Margaret, though there was pride in her voice as though the invitation belonged to her alone. "This is a tremendous opportunity for this family. The Duke has many unmarried friends of excellent standing. Perhaps one of them will take notice of Louis's cousin, or even offer some introduction that might finally settle Eleanor's situation." Charlotte laughed lightly. I do not think even a duke's ballroom holds enough magic for that, mother. More laughter followed, and Alina sat through it with practiced patience, though inside her chest something had gone very still and very quiet. The Duke of Dunhollow. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone had. He was spoken of in every drawing room and every newspaper, a man of great fortune who had inherited his title unexpectedly and had spent the years since building a reputation for being both brilliant and unreachable. He attended almost nothing. He was rarely seen, and when he was seen, it was said that he never smiled and never lingered. She told herself it could not be him. There were many titles in England, many young men who had once been ordinary before fortune changed their names. It was surely a coincidence, nothing more. She had not allowed herself to think of Alaric in years, not truly, not without immediately pushing the memory away before it could take root and grow into something painful. And yet the name Dunhollow settled into her mind and refused to leave. "Alina, are you listening?" her mother asked sharply. "Yes, mother, Dunhollow Hall. It sounds like a fine evening." "It will be the finest of the season," Mrs. Ashworth said. "You must wear your best gown, though I doubt it will matter much for you. Still, we cannot have you looking shabby in front of a duke." "Perhaps she can stand near the refreshments," Louisa suggested with a small, unkind smile. "Out of the way so she does not embarrass anyone." Alina felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from the effort of holding back a sharper reply. She had grown skilled at swallowing these moments, at letting them pass over her like weather she could not control. She reminded herself, as she often did, that her sister's cruelty said far more about them than it ever could about her. "I will try not to be a burden," she said simply, and rose from her seat. "If you will excuse me, I have letters to finish before supper." She left the room before anyone could offer another remark, her footsteps light and even on the wooden floor, though her thoughts moved far more quickly than her feet. She climbed the narrow staircase to her small chamber at the end of the hall, closed the door softly behind her, and sat down at the writing desk beneath the window. For a long moment she simply stared at the blank paper in front of her, her pen untouched, her mind circling back again and again to that single word. Dunhollow. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she rarely opened, and drew out a small wooden box tied with a faded ribbon. Inside lay a handful of pressed flowers, long since turned brown and brittle, and a single folded letter she had read so many times over the years that the creases had softened into near transparency. She did not unfold it now. She did not need to. She knew every word by heart, though it was not a letter from him. It was the last letter she had written to him, one that had never been sent, because by the time she finished it, she no longer knew where to send it. 10 years. 10 years since a young man named Alaric had walked out of her life without explanation, leaving behind nothing but silence, and a wound she had never quite allowed to heal. She had built a life around that silence. She had learned to be useful, to be steady, to be the sister who managed the household accounts and settled disputes, and never asked for more than what was given to her. She had told herself over the years that whatever she had felt for him had been the foolishness of youth, nothing more. But now, sitting in the fading light with the little wooden box open before her, she felt that old ache stir again, sharp and unmistakable. She closed the box carefully and placed it back in the drawer, pushing it shut with more force than necessary. It could not be him, she told herself firmly. The world was large, and titles changed hands, and there was no reason to believe that the reclusive Duke of Dunhollow was the same young man who had once walked beside her through her father's orchard, speaking of futures they would never share. And yet, as she rose from her desk and moved to the window, looking out over the darkening garden below, she could not quiet the small, persistent voice inside her that whispered otherwise. Downstairs, she could still hear her sister's laughter drifting up through the floorboards, light and careless, already planning which gowns they would wear and which gentlemen they hoped to impress. None of them noticed that Alina had gone quiet. None of them ever did. She pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, watching the last color drain from the sky, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember. She remembered the warmth of a hand closing gently over hers. She remembered a voice, low and certain, telling her that no matter what happened, no matter where life took him, he would find his way back to her. She had believed him with the whole of her young and unguarded heart. Then the letters had stopped. The visits had stopped. And one day, quite suddenly, she had learned from a passing acquaintance that he had left the county entirely, gone to settle some family matter far away, with no word left behind for her. She had waited. She had waited far longer than pride should have allowed. And when no explanation ever came, she had done the only thing left to do. She had folded away her heartbreak, tucked it into a small wooden box, and become the practical, capable Alina that her family now mocked for having no husband. She had told herself she was at peace with it. But standing now at her window, with the name Dunhollow echoing through her mind like a bell that would not stop ringing, she was no longer certain that was true. Below in the drawing room, her mother's voice rose once more, bright and eager, already speaking of the grand ballroom they would soon enter, the chandeliers, the music, the important people they might meet. Alina turned from the window and pressed her palm flat against her chest, willing her heart to settle. Whatever waited for her at Dunhollow Hall, she told herself, she would face it the way she had faced everything else these past 10 years, with her head held high and her heart carefully guarded. She only wished she could believe, as easily as she said it, that her heart was truly as guarded as she needed it to be. The days leading up to the ball passed in a whirlwind of fittings, fabric swatches, and endless discussion of who might be present at Dunhollow Hall. The Ashworth household buzzed with an energy Alina had not seen in years, though she remained, as always, on the quiet edges of it. Her sisters spent their afternoons trying on gowns of silk and satin, comparing ribbons and gloves, debating which colors would best catch the eye of eligible gentlemen. Margaret favored a deep blue that matched her husband's family crest, hoping to remind everyone of her connections. Charlotte chose a pale rose, insisting it made her look younger than her years. Louisa, still newly married and eager to prove her charm had not faded, selected a gown of shimmering gold that left little room for modesty. Alina was fitted almost as an afterthought. Her mother handed the dressmaker a length of plain gray fabric with barely a glance, remarking that Alina did not need anything elaborate since no one would be looking at her regardless. "Something simple will do," Mrs. Ashworth said, already turning her attention back to Louis's gold silk. "We must save our best efforts where they will actually matter." Alina accepted the gray fabric without complaint. She had long since stopped expecting anything different, and in truth, she preferred simplicity. It suited her and it required no pretense. Her closest friend, Grace Whitmore, visited 2 days before the ball, finding Alina alone in the small sitting room with a stack of household ledgers spread before her. Grace had known Alina since childhood, long before the Duke of Dunhollow had ever entered either of their lives, and she was one of the very few people who knew the truth of what had happened 10 years ago. "You are doing sums again," Grace said, settling into the chair across from her with an exasperated sigh. "The night before the grandest ball of the season, and you are counting candle expenses." "Someone must," Alina replied, though a small smile touched her lips. "My mother has spent enough on gowns this week to fund a small army." Grace waved a hand dismissively. "Never mind the gowns. Tell me how you are truly feeling about all this. The invitation, Dunhollow Hall." Alina set down her pen slowly, choosing her words with care. "I feel nothing in particular. It is simply another ball." "Alina," Grace's voice softened, and she leaned forward, taking her friend's hand. "You know as well as I do that it is not simply another ball, not if there is even the smallest chance that the Duke of Dunhollow is who we both suspect he might be." Alina's fingers tightened briefly around Grace's before she pulled her hand away, folding it neatly in her lap. "It has been 10 years, Grace. People change their names when they inherit titles. There must be dozens of dukes across the country who were once ordinary men with ordinary names. There is no reason to believe it is him." "And yet you have not stopped thinking about it since the invitation arrived," Grace said gently. "I can see it in your face. You have that same look you had the week after he disappeared, when you used to sit by the window for hours, waiting for a letter that never came." Elinor looked away, out toward the small garden visible through the sitting-room window. "I have made peace with what happened. I do not need to relive it simply because a title shares a name that reminds me of him." "Have you truly made peace with it?" Grace asked quietly. "Or have you simply stopped speaking of it aloud?" The question landed with more weight than Elinor was prepared for, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. The ledger before her blurred slightly as her eyes filled, though she blinked the feeling away before it could fully take hold. "It does not matter now," she said finally. "Even if it is him, 10 years have passed. He is a duke, and I am the unmarried sister everyone pities. Whatever we once were to each other, it belongs to a different life entirely." Grace studied her for a long moment, her expression a mixture of sympathy and quiet frustration. "You deserve better than what your family gives you, Elinor. You always have. I only hope that whatever happens at that ball, you remember your own worth, regardless of whether any duke crosses a ballroom to find you." Elinor managed a small, grateful smile, though the ache in her chest had not eased in the slightest. "Thank you, Grace, truly." After Grace left, Elinor remained alone in the sitting room for a long while, staring down at the columns of numbers without truly seeing them. Her mind had wandered back, as it so often did lately, to the last summer she had spent with Alaric, before everything had fallen apart. She remembered the day it began to unravel with painful clarity. It had started with a letter from his family, urgent and troubling, calling him away to attend to matters concerning his father's estate. He had come to her that same afternoon, his face pale with worry, and told her he would be gone for a fortnight, perhaps longer, but that he would write to her every single day until he returned. She remembered believing him completely. She remembered the warmth in his eyes as he had taken her hands and promised that nothing, not distance nor time nor circumstance, would change what existed between them. The first week no letters came. She told herself it was simply the difficulty of travel, the unreliability of the post. By the second week, she began to worry in earnest, writing to him nearly every day even as her own letters went unanswered. By the third week, whispers had begun to circulate through the county that the young man's family had suffered a great financial ruin, and that he had been sent away entirely, perhaps never to return. She never learned the full truth of what happened during those weeks. She only knew that when a month had passed with no word at all, she finally received a short, cold letter, not from Alaric himself, but from a relation of his family, informing her in the plainest terms that Mr. Alaric Vane had no further intention of continuing any association with her, and that she should consider the matter closed. She had read that letter so many times the ink had nearly worn away from the folds. She remembered the way her whole world had seemed to collapse in that single moment, the way she had cried until she had no tears left, and the way she had eventually risen from her bed, dried her face, and decided that she would never again allow herself to be so thoroughly undone by anyone. She had never questioned the truth of that letter. Why would she? It bore his family's seal. It spoke with such certainty and such coldness that she could not imagine it being anything other than genuine. And so she had accepted it, buried her grief deep within herself, and moved forward with her life as best she could. It was only in quiet, unguarded moments like this one, sitting alone with old ledgers and older memories, that she allowed herself to wonder, just for a heartbeat, whether that letter had told the whole truth. She shook her head firmly, closing the ledger with more force than necessary. It did no good to dwell on such things. Whatever had happened 10 years ago was long finished, and dwelling on it now would only open wounds better left closed. The evening of the ball arrived far too quickly. Elinor stood before the small mirror in her chamber as her maid fastened the last buttons of her simple gray gown, the fabric plain but well fitted, falling in soft folds that suited her quiet elegance far better than her mother had intended. "You look lovely, miss," the maid said kindly, stepping back to admire her work. Elinor studied her own reflection for a long moment. She saw a woman of 28 years, her dark hair swept up neatly, her expression calm despite the storm of feeling churning beneath the surface. She did not look like a woman who had given up on life, though she knew that was precisely how her family saw her. She thought briefly of the wooden box tucked away in her desk drawer, of the pressed flowers and the unsent letter within it. She thought of Alaric's face, the last time she had seen him, full of warmth and promise that had ultimately proven false. Whatever awaited her at Dunhollow Hall tonight, she told herself firmly, she would meet it with dignity. If the Duke of Dunhollow was indeed the man she once loved, she would greet him as a stranger, with polite indifference and nothing more. And if he was not, then the evening would pass as countless others had, with her sisters shining brightly while she remained quietly at the edges, unnoticed and unbothered. Either way, she resolved, she would not allow herself to hope. Hope, she had learned long ago, was a dangerous and costly thing. Downstairs, her family gathered in the entrance hall, resplendent in their chosen gowns, laughing and chattering with excitement about the evening ahead. Mrs. Ashworth looked Alina over once, gave a short nod of approval that held no real warmth, and turned her attention immediately back to Louis's golden gown. "Remember," Mrs. Ashworth said as the carriage was brought around, "tonight is important for this family. Smile, be pleasant, and do not embarrass us." "I will do my best, Mother," Alina said quietly, and climbed into the carriage behind her sisters. As the carriage rolled forward into the darkening evening, carrying them toward Dunhollow Hall and whatever awaited within its grand walls, Alina pressed her gloved hands together in her lap and stared out the window at the passing countryside, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of dread and something else, something she refused to name, something that felt dangerously close to hope after all. She thought of the last decade of her life, all the quiet years spent managing other people's households and other people's happiness while her own remained carefully sealed away. She thought of every unkind word her sisters had ever spoken, every pitying glance from relatives, every whispered comment about the sister who had let her chances slip away. And beneath all of it, buried deep where she had kept it hidden for 10 long years, she thought of him. Of gray eyes and gentle words and a promise that had shattered her heart into pieces she had spent a decade carefully gathering back together. Whatever waited for her tonight, she was no longer certain her carefully rebuilt heart was prepared for it. The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying her steadily toward Dunhollow Hall, toward a night that would change everything she thought she understood about her past and about herself. 10 years earlier, the world had smelled of apple blossoms and warm summer rain. Alina Ashworth was 18 years old that season, and she had never in her life felt as alive as she did walking through her father's orchard with Alaric Vane at her side. He was not yet a duke then. He was simply Alaric, the second son of a family whose fortunes had once been grand but had fallen into quiet difficulty, a young man with serious gray eyes and an easy laugh that seemed to belong only to her. "You are thinking too hard again," Alaric said that afternoon, reaching up to pluck a blossom from a low-hanging branch and tucking it gently behind her ear. "I can always tell. Your eyebrows draw together just so." "I am not thinking too hard," Alina protested, though a smile tugged at her lips. "I am simply wondering how a man who claims to know nothing of poetry manages to say such foolish, lovely things." "Perhaps it is not poetry at all," he said, taking her hand as they walked. "Perhaps it is only the truth, and the truth sounds like poetry when it is spoken about you." She had laughed then, bright and unguarded, the kind of laugh she had not allowed herself in the 10 years since. She remembered the warmth of his hand around hers, steady and sure, and the way the late afternoon light had turned everything golden, as though the whole world had conspired to make that single moment perfect. They had known each other for nearly a year by then, having met at a small gathering hosted by a mutual family friend. What had begun as polite conversation over tea had grown, slowly and carefully, into something neither of them had expected nor been prepared for. He was not wealthy, not by the standards her mother cared about, but he was kind and clever and utterly devoted to her. And for a young woman who had spent her whole life being compared unfavorably to more beautiful, more charming relations, His devotion had felt like a miracle. "My father wishes for me to make a proper match," she told him once, hesitant, as they sat together on a low stone wall at the edge of the orchard. "A match with fortune and standing. I do not think he would approve of us." Alaric had turned to face her fully then, his expression serious in a way that made her heart quicken. "Then I shall simply have to become a man of fortune and standing myself, so that he has no reason to object." "That is not so easily done," she had said, half laughing at the boldness of the claim. "Nothing worth having is easily done," he had replied, and though she had teased him for his confidence, some small part of her had believed him entirely. It was only a few weeks after that conversation that everything began to change. He had come to her one afternoon, his face drawn and pale, a letter clutched tightly in his hand. She remembered the fear that had gripped her the moment she saw his expression, before he had even spoken a word. "My father has fallen gravely ill," he told her, his voice tight with worry. "And there are matters concerning the estate that have grown urgent. My family's finances are far worse than I ever knew. I must go to him at once." "For how long?" she had asked, already dreading the answer. "A fortnight perhaps, no longer than that, I promise you." He had taken both her hands in his, holding them as though he could somehow transfer his certainty into her through touch alone. "I will write to you every single day, Alina. I swear it. And the moment matters are settled, I will return, and I will speak with your father properly, as I should have done long before now." "You promise?" she had asked, hating how small and uncertain her voice had sounded. "I promise you, with everything that I am, that nothing will keep me from returning to you." He had pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering there a moment longer than necessary. "Wait for me." "I will wait as long as it takes," she had told him, and she had meant every word of it. She remembered watching his carriage disappear down the long lane that ran alongside her father's property, remembered the strange, hollow feeling that had settled in her chest even as she told herself it was only temporary, only a fortnight, nothing more. The first days without him had passed slowly but hopefully. She had written to him faithfully, describing small details of her days, hoping the letters might bring him some comfort during whatever difficulties he faced with his family. She checked the post each morning with an eagerness she tried to hide from her sisters, who had already begun to tease her gently about her attachment to a man of modest fortune. When a full week passed without any reply, she told herself the post between counties was simply unreliable, that his father's illness surely demanded all his attention, that he would explain everything the moment he was able. By the second week, worry had begun to creep steadily into her hope. She wrote to him again, and again, her letters growing more anxious with each one, though she tried to keep her words light and encouraging, not wishing to burden him further during what she assumed was a difficult time. It was during the third week that whispers began to reach her, carried through the careless gossip of distant relations and family acquaintances. She heard that the Vane family's finances had collapsed far more severely than anyone had realized, that there were debts of a scale that threatened to ruin them entirely, and that Alaric himself had been sent away to distant relations to avoid the worst of the scandal. She refused to believe, even then, that he would abandon her without a word. She continued writing, continued waiting by the window each morning for the post, continued telling herself that whatever difficulties he faced, he would find a way to explain them to her eventually. Then, in the fourth week, a letter finally arrived, though it was not the letter she had spent a month longing for. It came not from Alaric himself, but from a woman who identified herself only as a cousin acting on behalf of the Vane family. The letter was brief and cold, written in a hand Alina did not recognize, and it informed her, in the plainest and most final terms, that Mr. Alaric Vane wished to end all association with her immediately and completely, that the family's circumstances required him to pursue a match of far greater fortune than she could offer, and that any further correspondence from her would go unanswered and unwelcomed. Alina remembered reading that letter standing at her writing desk, remembered the way the words had blurred and swum before her eyes, remembered the sound of the paper crumpling in her fist before she had even realized her hand had closed around it. She had not eaten for 2 full days afterward. She had not spoken to anyone beyond the barest necessary words. Her mother, mistaking her grief for simple embarrassment over a failed courtship, had told her sharply to compose herself and stop making a spectacle, that plenty of young men would come along in time, and that dwelling on one disappointing match served no purpose at all. Alina had never corrected her mother's assumption. It had seemed easier, in her raw and broken state, to let her family believe she had simply been disappointed rather than devastated, to let them believe she had lost interest rather than lost the one thing she had believed, with her whole young heart, would never leave her. In the weeks and months that followed, she had gathered every piece of herself back together, slowly and painfully, the way one might mend a shattered vase, knowing full well that the cracks would always remain visible no matter how carefully the pieces were fitted back into place. She had thrown herself into the practical matters of the household, had made herself useful and necessary in ways that left little room for grief, and had told herself, over and over, that she was better for having learned such a hard lesson so young. She had heard, eventually, that Alaric Vane's family fortunes had somehow been restored, that he had gone on to inherit an unexpected title through a distant relation, becoming the Duke of Dunhollow within only a few years of his disappearance from her life. She remembered the strange, hollow feeling of learning this, the sense that he had gone on to build an entirely new life, grand and glittering, while she had remained exactly where he left her, carrying a wound he likely never thought of again. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself for 10 long years that whatever they had shared belonged to a foolish, long-ago summer, and that dwelling on it served no purpose beyond keeping old wounds open. And yet, sitting now in the swaying carriage that carried her steadily toward Dunhollow Hall, dressed in her plain gray gown with her sisters chattering excitedly beside her, Alina could not stop the memories from rising, sharp and vivid, as though no time at all had passed since that golden afternoon in her father's orchard. She thought of his promise, spoken so earnestly all those years ago, "Nothing will keep me from returning to you." She thought of the cold, final letter that had followed only weeks later, a letter she had never once questioned, not truly, not until Grace's gentle words a few days ago had planted a small, unwelcome seed of doubt in her mind. What if, she allowed herself to wonder for the first time in a decade, that letter had not told the truth at all? The thought was dangerous, she knew. It offered a small, fragile hope where she had trained herself to expect none, and hope, she reminded herself firmly, had already cost her more pain than she cared to relive. The carriage rolled onward through the darkening countryside, drawing steadily closer to the grand, glowing lights of Dunhollow Hall in the distance. Alina watched those lights grow larger through the window, her heart caught somewhere between dread and a hope she refused to name, and wondered, with a mixture of fear and fragile longing, what truth awaited her within those walls. Whatever it was, she told herself firmly, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the past 10 years. She would not allow herself to be undone again. She only hoped, as the carriage rolled to a stop before the towering entrance of Dunhollow Hall, that her heart would prove as strong as her resolve. Dunhollow Hall rose before them like something out of a dream, its stone walls washed golden by hundreds of candles burning behind tall windows, its grand entrance framed by columns that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the night sky. Carriages lined the long drive, each one delivering guests dressed in silks and jewels, their laughter and chatter carrying on the cool evening air. Alina stepped down from the carriage behind her sisters, smoothing the simple gray fabric of her gown with steady hands, though her heart continued its restless, uneven rhythm beneath her calm exterior. Margaret and Charlotte moved ahead eagerly, already scanning the crowd of arriving guests for familiar faces, while Louisa lingered just long enough to cast a critical glance over Alina's appearance. "Do try to stand somewhere unobtrusive tonight," Louisa murmured, adjusting her own golden gloves. "We would not wish for you to draw attention away from anyone important." Alina said nothing, only inclined her head slightly and followed her family through the grand entrance and into the ballroom beyond. The room that opened before her was more magnificent than anything she had ever seen. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with clouds and gilded scrollwork, casting warm light across a sea of guests dressed in every shade of silk and satin. An orchestra played softly from a raised platform at the far end of the room, and couples already moved gracefully across the polished floor in the early steps of the evening's first dances. Aliner's mother swept forward immediately, greeting acquaintances with bright smiles and eager words, positioning her daughters carefully within view of the most important guests. Margaret and Charlotte fell easily into the rhythm of the evening, laughing and conversing with practiced charm, drawing the attention of several young gentlemen within only a few minutes of their arrival. Louisa, meanwhile, made her way toward a cluster of fashionable women near the refreshment table, eager to display her golden gown to its fullest advantage. Aliner found a quiet spot near the edge of the room, close to one of the tall windows, where she could observe the glittering evening without being drawn too deeply into its currents. She had attended enough balls over the years to know exactly how this one would unfold. Her sisters would dance and flirt and collect admiring glances, while she would stand quietly at the edges, offered polite nods by passing acquaintances who pitied her, and occasionally overhear whispered comments about the eldest Ashworth daughter who had somehow failed to secure a match despite so many years of trying. Tonight was no different, at least not at first. "There she is," she heard a woman murmur nearby, not quite quietly enough. "The eldest Ashworth girl, still unmarried, I hear, after all these years. Such a pity, really, given how accomplished her sisters have become." "I heard she simply never received a proper offer," another voice replied. "Perhaps she is too particular, or perhaps no one was particular enough to overlook whatever flaw kept her from marrying." Aliner kept her gaze fixed steadily on the dancers moving across the floor, refusing to let her expression betray how deeply such words still managed to wound her, even after so many years of hearing similar ones. She reminded herself, as she always did, that these women knew nothing of her life, nothing of the choices and circumstances that had shaped her path, and that their opinions, however unkind, held no real power over her worth. Still, the ache remained, quiet and familiar, settling into her chest as she watched her younger sisters shine so effortlessly beneath the chandelier light. The evening continued in much the same manner for nearly an hour. Aliner exchanged brief pleasantries with a handful of older relations, accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing servant, and watched from her quiet corner as the ballroom grew ever more crowded and lively. She had nearly resigned herself to a long evening of quiet observation when a sudden shift rippled through the room, beginning near the grand entrance and spreading outward like a wave. The music did not stop, but conversations began to falter. Heads turned. A hush fell across sections of the crowd in rapid succession, guests stepping aside and lowering their voices as though some great presence had entered the room. Aliner turned, along with nearly everyone else, to see what had caused such a stir. Standing just inside the grand entrance was a tall man dressed in dark, impeccably tailored evening clothes, his bearing straight and commanding, his expression composed in a manner that suggested a man accustomed to being observed and rarely troubled by it. Even from across the crowded room, Aliner could see the way guests parted instinctively before him, offering deep bows and curtsies as he passed, though he acknowledged each with only the briefest, most economical of nods. "The Duke of Dunhollow," someone near her whispered, all unmistakable in their voice. "He almost never attends events. I cannot imagine what has brought him out tonight." Aliner's breath caught somewhere deep in her chest, and for a long moment she could not move at all. Even from this distance, even after 10 years, something in the set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried himself, struck a chord of recognition so deep and sudden that her hands began to tremble against the stem of her lemonade glass. She told herself it could not be him. She told herself that grief and memory were playing tricks upon her mind, conjuring familiarity where none truly existed. But then he turned his head slightly, surveying the crowded ballroom with an expression of polite detachment, and for one brief, unmistakable moment, she saw his face fully in the candlelight. Gray eyes. Serious, steady gray eyes that she would have recognized anywhere, in any lifetime, no matter how many years had passed. It was him, it was truly, unmistakably him. Alina's heart seemed to stop entirely before lurching forward into a rapid, unsteady rhythm. She set her glass down on a nearby table with hands that shook far more than she wished, and she found herself utterly unable to look away, even as every instinct urged her to flee the room entirely before he could see her. Across the ballroom, Margaret and Charlotte had already begun maneuvering themselves closer to the Duke's path, their eyes bright with calculation, clearly hoping to catch his attention or that of any wealthy gentleman who might be standing near him. Louisa abandoned her cluster of fashionable friends entirely, positioning herself near the center of the room where the Duke would surely pass. Alina remained frozen near the window, torn between the desperate urge to disappear into the crowd and the equally powerful, terrifying pull to simply watch him, to drink in the sight of a face she had spent 10 years trying and failing to forget. The Duke moved through the ballroom with unhurried grace, pausing occasionally to exchange brief, polite words with guests who approached him, though his expression remained largely unreadable, composed and distant in a manner that spoke of a man who had grown accustomed to guarding himself carefully from the world. Alina watched him greet a cluster of admiring young women near the center of the room, watched him incline his head politely to an older gentleman who engaged him in conversation, watched him move steadily, almost aimlessly, through the crowd, as though searching for something without quite knowing where to find it. Then, quite suddenly, his gaze lifted from the immediate crowd around him and swept across the wider ballroom, moving past dancers and clusters of guests with an unhurried, searching quality that made Alina's chest tighten, with something between fear and desperate hope. His eyes reached the far side of the room, near the tall windows, and stopped. For a long, suspended moment, Alina could not breathe at all. Across the crowded, glittering distance of the ballroom, the Duke of Dunhollow's gaze found hers and held there, steady and unwavering, as though every other person in the room had simply ceased to exist. She saw something shift in his expression, something that broke through the composed, distant mask he had worn throughout the evening. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, his lips parting slightly as though he meant to speak despite the distance between them. And for one fleeting instant, Alina saw not the powerful, reclusive Duke of Dunhollow standing before her, but the young man she had once loved with her whole unguarded heart, looking at her with an expression of such raw, unmistakable recognition that her legs very nearly gave way beneath her. Around her, the whispers began almost immediately, rippling through the nearby guests as they noticed the direction of the Duke's fixed attention. Who is he looking at? Surely not the eldest Ashworth girl, standing there by the window. He has not looked away, do you see? He has not looked away at all. Alina barely heard any of it. Her entire awareness had narrowed to the man standing across the ballroom, to the gray eyes that had not wavered from hers since the moment they met, to the impossible, overwhelming reality that after 10 years of silence, after a decade of believing herself forgotten and discarded, Alaric Vane, now the Duke of Dunhollow, stood before her once more. Then, without a single word to the guests still attempting to engage him in conversation, without so much as a glance toward Margaret or Charlotte or Louisa, all of whom had positioned themselves so carefully in his path, the Duke of Dunhollow began to walk. He walked directly across the ballroom, cutting through the crowd with purposeful, unhurried strides, his gaze never once leaving Alina's face. Guests stepped aside instinctively, murmuring in astonishment as they watched one of the most powerful and reclusive men in England move past duchesses and diplomats' daughters, past every eligible young woman in the room who had spent the evening hoping to catch his attention, all to reach the quiet, unmarried eldest daughter of a modest family, standing alone and forgotten near the window. Alina's heart pounded so violently, she feared everyone around her must surely hear it. She watched him approach, each step drawing him closer, his expression growing more visible, more unmistakably familiar, until at last he stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines that had formed at the corners of his eyes, evidence of a decade she had not witnessed, a decade lived entirely apart from her. The entire ballroom had gone silent around them, every eye fixed upon the extraordinary scene unfolding by the tall windows. Alina barely noticed any of it. She could see nothing beyond the man standing before her, could hear nothing beyond the sound of her own unsteady breathing and the distant, muffled beat of her heart. "Alina," he said quietly, his voice exactly as she remembered it, low and steady and achingly familiar. "It is truly you." She opened her mouth to respond, though no words came at first, her throat tight with 10 years of grief and longing and confusion, all rising to the surface at once. "Your Grace," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, formal and careful even as her heart threatened to break open entirely. Something flickered across his expression at her formal address, something that looked almost like pain. "Please," he said softly, "not that, not from you." Around them, the whispers continued to spread through the stunned ballroom, but Alina scarcely registered them at all. She stood frozen before the man she had spent a decade trying to forget, the man whose sudden reappearance had just upended every careful, guarded piece of the life she had built in his absence, and found herself utterly unable to look away from his familiar gray eyes. Whatever explanation awaited her, whatever truth he had come to offer after 10 long years of silence, she understood in that single suspended moment that nothing about her life would ever be quite the same again. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity, though it could not have lasted more than a few seconds. Around the edges of Alina's awareness, she could sense the ballroom watching, waiting, hundreds of eyes fixed upon the extraordinary sight of the Duke of Dunhollow standing before the quietest, least remarkable woman in the room. "You look well," Alaric said finally, his voice careful, as though he were choosing each word with great deliberation. "Truly well, Alina." "As do your." She caught herself before repeating the title he had asked her not to use, and settled instead on something less formal, though it felt strange and dangerous on her tongue after so many years. "As do you, Alaric." His name, spoken aloud for the first time in a decade, seemed to affect him deeply. Something shifted behind his composed expression, a flicker of emotion he did not quite manage to hide. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," he said. "When I saw the guest list, I confess I hoped, though I told myself I should not." Alina's chest tightened at his words, though she kept her expression carefully guarded. She had spent 10 years building walls around her heart, and she was not prepared to let them crumble simply because he stood before her now, however familiar and however achingly missed his presence remained. "My family received an invitation through my sister's husband's connections," she said simply. "I did not know, when we accepted, that Dunhollow Hall belonged to you. Would you have come had you known?" His question was quiet, almost hesitant, so unlike the confident, composed manner in which he had crossed the ballroom only moments before. Alina considered the question honestly before answering. "I do not know," she admitted. "Perhaps not. Perhaps I would have found some excuse to remain at home." He nodded slowly, accepting her honesty without argument, though something like disappointment passed briefly across his features. Around them, the orchestra continued its gentle melody, though the dancers nearby had slowed their steps considerably, many of them watching the unfolding scene with poorly disguised curiosity. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" he asked, extending his hand toward her with a formality that felt both familiar and entirely new. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after so many years of silence, but I find myself asking regardless." Alina looked down at his outstretched hand, memories flooding through her mind with painful clarity, memories of another hand, younger and less certain, reaching for hers across a sunlit orchard so many years ago. She thought of every unkind word her sisters had spoken about her unmarried state, every pitying glance from relations who assumed she had simply failed to secure a match. She thought of the wooden box hidden in her desk drawer, the pressed flowers and unsent letter she had kept for a decade, as the only remaining evidence that any of it had been real. And she thought, too, of the small, dangerous seed of doubt Grace had planted only days before. What if the letter that had ended everything between them had not told the truth at all? Slowly, deliberately, Alina placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with careful, deliberate gentleness, as though he feared she might disappear entirely if he held on too tightly or too loosely. A visible ripple of astonishment moved through the watching crowd as he led her toward the center of the dance floor, and Alina caught sight of her mother's face among the onlookers, pale with shock, her mouth slightly open as though she could not quite believe what she was witnessing. Margaret and Charlotte stood frozen near the edge of the dancing couples, their earlier confidence entirely evaporated, replaced by expressions of stunned disbelief as they watched their elder sister, the sister they had mocked only days before for being unwed and unwanted, being led onto the dance floor by the most sought-after man in the entire ballroom. Alina tried her best to ignore the weight of so many watching eyes as Alaric settled his hand at her waist and drew her gently into position for the dance. The orchestra shifted into a slower, more graceful melody, and around them, other couples resumed their dancing, though many continued to steal curious glances toward the center of the floor. "Your family seems surprised," Alaric observed quietly as they began to move together, his steps sure and practiced, guiding her effortlessly across the polished floor. "My family has spent the past several years believing I am entirely unremarkable," Alina replied, unable to keep a note of dry honesty from her voice. "I imagine this evening will require some adjustment to that belief." Something that might have been the ghost of his old, easy smile touched his lips, though it faded quickly into something more solemn. "You were never unremarkable, Alina. Not to me. Not in all the years since." "You have a curious way of showing such regard," she said, and though she kept her voice level and composed, she could not entirely hide the edge of pain beneath her words. 10 years of silence is not typically how one honors someone they claim to have held in such high esteem. He winced visibly at her words, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "I know how it must have seemed," he said quietly. "I have thought of little else these past 10 years, wondering what you must have believed of me, wondering if there was ever any way to explain what truly happened." "Then explain it," Alina said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the dance had begun, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning within her. "Tell me what happened, Alaric. Tell me why a man who promised to write to me every single day disappeared so completely that I did not hear a single word from him again, not until tonight, 10 years later." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his eyes clouded with what looked like genuine anguish. "It is not a simple story," he said finally, "and I do not believe this ballroom, surrounded by so many curious eyes, is the proper place to tell it." Alina felt a familiar flicker of old suspicion rise within her, the protective instinct she had cultivated over 10 years of guarding herself against further hurt. "Convenient," she said, though there was less bitterness in her voice than she had intended and more genuine hurt. "It seems explanations were always somehow too complicated to offer, even when they mattered most." "Alina," his voice was low and urgent now, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. "I promise you, upon everything I hold dear, that I have wanted to explain myself to you for 10 years. I did not know how to find you, nor whether you would even wish to hear from me after everything that happened. Please, grant me the chance to explain properly, away from all these watching eyes." The music continued around them, and Alina found herself studying his face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that his words were merely practiced charm rather than genuine feeling. What she found instead was something raw and unguarded, an expression that reminded her achingly of the young man she had once trusted completely, before the world had taught her the danger of such trust. "After this dance," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, "you may explain yourself, but I make no promises about how I shall receive whatever you have to say." "That is more than I have any right to ask for," he said, relief and gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you, Alina." They finished the dance in comparative silence, though the air between them had shifted into something charged and heavy with unspoken history. Alina was acutely aware of every point where his hand touched hers, every moment their eyes met across the small distance between them, and she found herself fighting against the old, familiar warmth that had once made her feel so entirely safe in his presence. She reminded herself, with effort, that safety was precisely what she had lost the last time she had trusted him so completely, and that whatever explanation he offered tonight would need to account for far more than simple circumstance before she allowed herself to feel that warmth again without reservation. As the final notes of the melody faded, Alaric led her from the dance floor toward the edge of the ballroom, away from the thickest crowds of curious onlookers, though whispers continued to follow them regardless. Alina caught fragments of the astonished conversations swirling around them, comments about the Duke's unprecedented attention toward the eldest, unmarried Ashworth daughter, speculation about what history might exist between two people who seemed, by all appearances, to be strangers of vastly different standing. Her mother intercepted them before they had gone far, her expression a peculiar mixture of confusion and barely contained excitement. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ashworth said, curtsying so deeply Alina feared she might lose her balance entirely. "What an honor, what an unexpected honor, to see you take such interest in my daughter." "Mrs. Ashworth," Alaric said politely, though Alina noticed the careful reserve in his tone, so different from the warmth he had shown her only moments before. "Your daughter and I are old acquaintances. I wonder if I might borrow her for a private conversation, if you would permit it." Mrs. Ashworth's eyes widened considerably, darting quickly between Alaric and Alina as though trying to piece together some explanation for this astonishing turn of events. "Of course, Your Grace. Of course, whatever you wish." Alina caught sight of her sisters standing nearby, their expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to something that looked distinctly like envy, and despite the turmoil churning within her own heart, she felt a small, unfamiliar spark of quiet satisfaction at the sight. Alaric guided her gently away from the crowded ballroom, through a set of tall doors that led out onto a private terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens below. The cool evening air was a welcome relief after the warmth and noise of the ballroom, and Alina drew in a slow, steadying breath as the doors closed behind them, leaving them alone together for the first time in 10 years. "Now," she said, turning to face him fully, her arms crossed protectively over her chest despite her best efforts to appear composed. "Tell me the truth, Alaric, all of it. I have waited 10 years for an explanation, and I find I am no longer willing to wait a moment longer." He met her gaze steadily, his expression grave and determined, and Alina braced herself for whatever truth he had carried with him across a decade of silence. Alaric moved to the stone railing at the edge of the terrace, resting his hands against the cool surface as he gathered his thoughts, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of pain that Alina had not expected. "When I left you that summer," he began, "my father's illness was every bit as serious as I told you. What I did not know then was how deeply our family's finances had already collapsed, nor how desperate my relations had become to see the situation resolved through whatever means necessary." Alina remained silent, watching him carefully, her arms still crossed protectively as she waited for him to continue. "I wrote to you every single day exactly as I promised," he said, turning to face her again, his gray eyes filled with old grief. "I wrote to you from my father's estate, describing everything, the illness, the debts, the fear that gripped our household during those weeks. I told you in nearly every letter how desperately I longed to return to you." "I received none of those letters," Alina said quietly. "Not a single one." "I know that now," he said, his voice tight with old anger. "I did not know it then. During those weeks, my father's cousin, a woman named Beatrice Vane, had taken it upon herself to manage much of our household correspondence, given how consumed my father and I were with matters of the estate. I trusted her entirely, believing her to be acting in our family's best interest." Alina felt a cold, sinking dread settle in her stomach, already anticipating where this explanation might lead. Go on, she said quietly. Cousin Beatrice believed, quite firmly, that our family's survival depended upon my making a match of significant fortune, given how dire our finances had become, Alaric continued, his jaw tight with old bitterness. She did not approve of my attachment to you, believing you a pleasant but insufficiently wealthy match for a family in such desperate circumstances. I did not learn until much later exactly how far she was willing to go to prevent our marriage. She intercepted your letters, Alina said slowly, the pieces settling into place with painful clarity. The letters you wrote to me, she never sent them. Yes, Alaric confirmed, his voice heavy with old shame. Every letter I wrote to you during those weeks, she collected under the guise of managing our household correspondence and destroyed before they ever reached you. I did not know this at the time. I believed, quite simply, that my letters were reaching you, and that your silence in return meant something else entirely. Alina's breath caught sharply. My silence, but I wrote to you as well nearly every day. Did those letters never reach you either? No, he said, and something in his expression, some old wound reopening, made Alina's chest tighten with dawning understanding. They did not. Cousin Beatrice intercepted those as well, and worse, she fabricated letters in your name, Alina, letters that claimed you had grown tired of waiting, that you had accepted the attentions of another gentleman of greater fortune, that you wished for me to cease writing to you entirely. The revelation struck Alina like a physical blow. She forged letters in my name, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, claiming I had abandoned you. Yes, Alaric said, his voice rough with old pain. I received what I believed to be a letter from you, informing me that you had chosen another match, that whatever we had shared meant little to you in comparison to a more advantageous prospect. I was devastated, Alina. I could not understand how the woman I loved so completely could change so suddenly, but I had no reason to doubt the letter's authenticity. It bore what appeared to be your hand, your particular manner of expression. She must have studied my letters carefully to forge such a thing convincingly, Alina said, her mind racing back through the confusion and heartbreak of that terrible month. And the letter I received, claiming to be from a cousin of your family, informing me that you wished to end all association with me entirely. That was her as well. I did not learn of that letter's existence until years later, Alaric said grimly. By the time I discovered the full extent of Cousin Beatrice's deception, you had already stopped responding entirely, and I assumed, based on the forged letter I had received, that this simply confirmed you had indeed moved on to a more suitable match. I had no reason to seek you out again, believing as I did that you had chosen to end things between us of your own accord. Alina felt tears beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to let them fall until she had heard the entire truth. How did you eventually discover what she had done? Nearly 3 years after that terrible summer, Alaric said, my father passed away, and shortly after, an unexpected inheritance brought me the title of Duke of Dunhollow through a distant relation none of us had anticipated. In settling my father's affairs, I discovered a hidden collection of correspondence among Cousin Beatrice's belongings, letters she had never intended anyone to find. Among them were my own letters to you, every single one I had written during those terrible weeks, along with drafts of the forged letters she had sent in your name. Why did you not seek me out then? Alina asked, the question rising before she could stop herself, old grief and fresh confusion warring within her. If you discovered the truth 3 years after we parted, why did another 7 years pass before you sought me out again? Alaric's expression grew even more pained, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring out over the moonlit garden as though gathering the courage to continue. I was ashamed, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashamed that I had believed the forged letter so readily, ashamed that I had not trusted in what we shared enough to seek confirmation directly from you, ashamed that years had already passed, and I did not know how to explain such a lengthy silence, even once I understood the truth of what had happened. And I confess, Alina, I feared that even if I sought you out, I would find you already married, already settled into a life that no longer had room for the ghost of a courtship interrupted by another woman's cruelty. So instead you simply remained silent, Elinor said, though there was less anger in her voice now than aching sorrow. For 7 more years, you carried this knowledge, and yet you never once attempted to find me to explain, to offer even the smallest apology for what had happened. I know how inadequate that must sound to you now, Alaric said, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes filled with genuine anguish. I built an entire life around my title and my responsibilities, throwing myself into the management of estates and the duties of my position, telling myself that whatever chance we once had was long since lost, that seeking you out after so many years would only cause you further pain rather than offering any comfort. I told myself countless reasons for my silence, Elinor, and I recognize now how thoroughly I failed you by accepting them. Elinor turned away from him, moving to the edge of the terrace, gripping the cool stone railing as she attempted to steady the storm of emotion churning within her. 10 years of grief, of carefully guarded pain, of believing herself abandoned and unworthy of the love she had once been so certain of, all of it now recontextualized by a single, devastating revelation. She had not been abandoned at all. She had been deceived, manipulated by a woman she had never even met, a woman whose jealousy or ambition had cost both Elinor and Alaric a decade of happiness they might otherwise have shared. When the invitation arrived for tonight's ball, she said quietly, still facing away from him, I told myself it could not possibly be you. I told myself I had built an entire decade of peace around the belief that you had simply stopped loving me, that whatever we shared had meant less to you than I had once believed. It was easier, in some strange way, to accept that explanation than to wonder what else might have happened. I am so deeply sorry, Elinor, Alaric said, moving to stand beside her at the railing, though he did not reach for her, seeming to sense that she needed space to process the weight of everything he had shared. I cannot undo the years we lost, nor can I erase the pain my silence caused you, both during those terrible weeks and in all the years since. But I promise you, with complete honesty this time, that not a single day passed during that decade when I did not think of you, when I did not wonder what might have been had circumstances unfolded differently. Elinor finally turned to face him, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, though her expression held something beyond simple grief, something that looked almost like the first fragile stirrings of relief. Why did you seek me out tonight after so many years of silence? What changed? I saw your family's name on the guest list several days ago, Alaric admitted, and something in me could not resist the possibility, however small, that you might be among the guests attending. I have spent 10 years telling myself that reaching out to you would only cause further pain, but the moment I saw your name, I understood that I could not continue living with the regret of never having explained myself properly, never having offered you the truth you deserved, regardless of whether you chose to forgive me for my years of silence. Elinor studied his face carefully in the moonlight, searching for any remaining trace of doubt, and found instead only raw, unguarded sincerity. The same sincerity she remembered from a young man who had once promised her, in a sunlit orchard a lifetime ago, that nothing would keep him from returning to her. I do not know how to feel, she admitted honestly, wiping at her tears with trembling fingers. 10 years of grief cannot simply disappear because you have finally offered an explanation, however honest and however painful it was for you to share. I have built an entire life around the belief that I was not worthy of the love you once offered me. Learning that this belief was built upon lies does not undo the years I spent living beneath its weight. I understand, Alaric said gently. I do not expect forgiveness tonight, Elinor, nor do I expect you to simply set aside a decade of pain because I have finally found the courage to explain myself. I only wished for you to know the truth, whatever you choose to do with it. You deserved that much, at the very least, after everything Cousin Beatrice's cruelty cost us both. Elinor drew in a slow, unsteady breath, looking out over the moonlit gardens below, her mind and heart caught in a storm of conflicting emotion. Anger at the years stolen from them, grief for the pain both of them had carried needlessly, and beneath it all, a small, fragile warmth she had believed long extinguished, stirring cautiously back to life at the sight of familiar gray eyes finally offering her the truth she had waited a decade to hear. "I need time," she said finally, turning back to face him. "Time to understand everything you have told me, time to decide what, if anything, I am prepared to offer you in return." "Take whatever time you need," Alaric said softly. "I have already waited 10 years, Alina. I can wait as long as necessary for you to find your way back to whatever peace you require, whether that peace includes me or not." Alina nodded slowly, grateful for his understanding, though her heart remained a tangled knot of grief and cautious, trembling hope as she turned to make her way back toward the glittering ballroom, leaving Alaric standing alone beneath the moonlit sky, watching her go with an expression of quiet, patient longing that she could feel upon her back long after she had disappeared through the terrace doors. By the time Alina returned to the ballroom, word of what had transpired on the terrace had already begun to spread through the glittering crowd, carried along by whispered speculation and curious glances that followed her every step. She held her chin high, refusing to let the weight of so many watching eyes unsettle the fragile calm she had managed to gather around herself. Her mother intercepted her almost immediately, practically trembling with a mixture of confusion and barely restrained excitement. "Alina," Mrs. Ashworth said, taking her arm and steering her toward a quieter corner of the room, "what on earth is happening? The Duke of Dunhollow spending nearly half an hour alone with you on the terrace. People are speaking of nothing else." "The Duke and I share a history, Mother," Alina said simply, too emotionally exhausted to offer further explanation. "One I was not at liberty to discuss until tonight." "A history?" Mrs. Ashworth's eyes widened considerably. "What sort of history? Alina, you must tell me at once." Before Alina could decide how much to reveal, Margaret and Charlotte approached, their earlier confidence entirely replaced by expressions of bewildered curiosity. Louisa trailed behind them, her golden gown suddenly seeming far less impressive than it had at the start of the evening. "Is it true," Margaret asked, her voice unusually hesitant, "that you and the Duke were acquainted before tonight?" Alina looked at her sisters, 3 women who had spent years mocking her unmarried state, dismissing her worth, treating her quiet dignity as evidence of failure rather than strength. She thought of every cutting remark, every pitying glance, every moment she had swallowed her hurt rather than defend herself against their casual cruelty. She could have told them everything in that moment. She could have described, in full and painful detail, the courtship they had known nothing about, the devastating deception that had torn her and Alaric apart, the 10 years of quiet grief she had carried while they laughed at her supposed failure to secure a match. She could have watched their faces crumble with guilt and shame, as they realized how thoroughly they had misjudged her. Instead, she chose a different path. "Alaric and I knew each other many years ago," she said calmly, "before he inherited his title. Circumstances separated us at the time, through no fault of either of ours, though neither of us understood that fully until tonight." "You never told us," Charlotte said, sounding almost accusatory, as though Alina's silence had somehow been an offense against her. "You never asked," Alina replied evenly, meeting her sister's eyes without flinching. "You simply assumed all these years that I had failed to secure a match through some flaw of my own making. It did not occur to any of you that perhaps my circumstances were more complicated than you cared to consider." A heavy silence fell over the small gathering. Louisa shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated. "We did not know," she said quietly, though the words sounded more defensive than apologetic. "No," Alina agreed. "You did not know because you never once thought to ask. You found it far easier to laugh at my expense, to call me a burden, to suggest I remain near the refreshments so as not to embarrass anyone with my presence. I have carried that treatment for years quietly, because I believed it was simply my role within this family to endure it." Mrs. Ashworth's face had gone pale, her earlier excitement replaced by something closer to shame. "Alina, we never meant such cruelty. We only worried for your future, your happiness." "Perhaps," Alina said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath it. "But worry does not typically manifest as mockery, Mother. If you were truly concerned for my happiness, you might have asked how I was faring, rather than assuming my unmarried state reflected some personal failure on my part." Margaret's eyes had filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simple embarrassment at being addressed so directly in a crowded ballroom, Elinor could not quite determine. "We are sorry, Elinor," she said quietly. "Truly. We did not realize how deeply our words affected you." "I know you did not realize," Elinor said, some of the tension easing from her shoulders as she allowed herself a small measure of grace toward her sisters, despite everything. "I do not say any of this to punish you, or to seek an apology I did not previously believe I deserved. I say it because tonight has taught me something important, something I hope all of you might learn as well." "What is that?" Charlotte asked softly. "That a person's worth is never determined by whether or not they have secured a husband," Elinor said, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "I spent 10 years believing myself unwanted, unworthy of the love I once knew, simply because circumstances beyond my control kept me from the marriage everyone believed I should have secured by now. Tonight I learned that the truth was far more complicated than any of us understood. But even before I learned that truth, I was never truly unworthy, not for a single moment of these past 10 years. None of us are defined by our marital status, however much society, or even our own families, might wish to convince us otherwise." The small gathering fell silent again, though this silence carried a different quality than before, heavier with reflection rather than discomfort. Elinor watched her sisters exchange uncertain glances, watched her mother's expression shift from shame toward something that looked almost like genuine reconsideration. "I hope," Elinor continued gently, "that going forward we might treat one another with more kindness, regardless of whatever circumstances life presents to each of us. I do not hold grudges easily, and I have no wish to carry bitterness toward my own family. But I will no longer accept being spoken of, or spoken to, as though my worth depends upon whether a man has chosen to marry me." "Of course, Elinor," Mrs. Ashworth said quickly, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm with unfamiliar gentleness. "Of course. We shall do better, I promise you." Louisa, who had remained quiet throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice smaller and more genuine than Elinor had heard from her in years. "I am truly sorry, Elinor. I said cruel things to you more than once, and I never once considered how they might have wounded you. I hope you can forgive me in time." Elinor offered her youngest sister a small, sincere smile. "I forgive you, Louisa, all of you. We are still family, whatever has passed between us, and I would rather move forward with kindness than remain trapped in old resentments." Across the ballroom, Elinor caught sight of Alaric watching the exchange from a respectful distance, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture suggested he had been prepared to intervene, had the conversation grown too difficult for her to bear alone. She offered him a small, grateful nod, silently communicating that she had managed well enough on her own, and watched a faint, relieved smile touch his lips in response. The remainder of the evening passed in a strange, altered atmosphere. Elinor's sisters, chastened by the conversation, treated her with an unfamiliar gentleness throughout the rest of the ball, introducing her to acquaintances with genuine warmth rather than dismissive indifference. And even Mrs. Ashworth seemed to watch her eldest daughter throughout the evening, with an expression closer to pride than the usual mixture of disappointment and obligation. Word of the Duke's attention toward Elinor continued to spread through the ballroom as the night progressed, and she found herself the subject of considerably more curious glances than she had ever experienced at any previous gathering. Where once such attention might have filled her with dread, tonight she found she could bear it with quiet dignity, buoyed by the knowledge that whatever whispers followed her, they no longer carried the particular sting of pity she had grown so accustomed to enduring. Near the end of the evening, as guests began preparing to depart, and carriages were called around to the grand entrance, Alaric approached her once more, his expression carrying a mixture of hope and careful restraint. "I do not wish to press you for more than you are prepared to offer," he said quietly. "But I would very much like the opportunity to see you again, Eleanor, if you would permit it. Properly this time, with no secrets between us." Eleanor studied his familiar face for a long moment, weighing 10 years of grief against the fragile, cautious hope that had begun stirring within her since their conversation on the terrace. She thought of everything she had learned that evening, of truths uncovered, and old wounds finally beginning to make sense, and she found that despite everything, despite the pain of the years they had lost, some part of her heart had never truly stopped hoping for exactly this moment. "I would like that," she said finally, and watched relief and quiet joy spread across his features in a manner that reminded her achingly of the young man she had once loved beneath the apple blossoms of her father's orchard, so many years and so much heartache ago. As her family's carriage rolled away from Dunhollow Hall later that night, carrying her home through the dark countryside, Eleanor found herself smiling softly to herself, her heart lighter than it had felt in a decade, though still cautious, still guarded against the possibility of further pain. Whatever awaited her in the days and weeks ahead, she understood that tonight had changed something fundamental within her, something that went far beyond the reappearance of a man she had once loved. She had learned at last to speak her own truth aloud, to demand the respect and kindness she had always deserved, and to understand that her worth had never depended upon anyone else's recognition of it, not even her own family's. Whatever happened next, she thought, watching the moonlit countryside roll past her window, she would face it as herself, fully and unapologetically, for perhaps the first time in 10 long years. In the weeks that followed the ball at Dunhollow Hall, Eleanor's life took on a rhythm she had never expected to know again. Alaric called upon her twice each week, always with proper formality, always accompanied by whichever chaperone the occasion required, though the warmth between them grew steadily with each visit, unhurried and careful in a way that felt entirely different from the eager, youthful courtship they had once shared. Their first proper visit took place in the small sitting room of the Ashworth household, where Eleanor's mother fussed nervously over the arrangement of chairs and the selection of tea, clearly overwhelmed by the prospect of hosting a duke within her modest home. Alaric, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the simplicity of the surroundings, settling into his chair with an ease that suggested he found the modest sitting room far more comfortable than the grand halls of his own estate. "You seem surprised that I am not more particular about my surroundings," he observed, catching the slightly puzzled expression Eleanor wore as she watched him accept a cup of tea from her mother's trembling hands. "I suppose I expected a duke to require rather grander accommodations," Eleanor admitted, a small smile touching her lips. "I spent the first 20 years of my life in far more modest circumstances than this," Alaric said quietly, once her mother had bustled away to fetch additional refreshments. "Wealth and title came to me unexpectedly, and rather late. I have never quite lost my appreciation for simpler comforts, nor my memory of what it felt like to worry over far more pressing matters than the grandeur of a sitting room." Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved by his words, recognizing in them the same humility and groundedness she had loved in him a decade ago, qualities that had apparently survived his unexpected rise to such considerable wealth and standing. It was, she realized, one of many small confirmations she had gathered over their weeks of renewed acquaintance, evidence that the man before her remained fundamentally the same person she had once trusted so completely, even after everything that had passed between them. Their conversations during these visits ranged widely, touching upon matters both light and serious. They spoke of books they had read during their years apart, of changes within the county, of Alaric's responsibilities managing his considerable estates, and of Eleanor's years spent quietly managing her own family's household affairs. Slowly, carefully, they began rebuilding the foundation of trust that Cousin Beatrice's cruel deception had once shattered so completely. "I have been thinking," Alaric said one afternoon, several weeks into their renewed acquaintance, as they walked together through the modest garden behind the Ashworth home, "about what became of Cousin Beatrice and whether you might wish to know." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I confess I have wondered," she admitted, "though I am not certain I wish to carry additional anger toward a woman I have never even met." She no longer resides within my household, Alaric said. Once I discovered the full extent of her deception, I could not in good conscience continue supporting her within our family's affairs. She has since married a gentleman of modest fortune and resides some distance from Dunhollow Hall. I have had no contact with her in several years, and I find I have little interest in renewing any such connection. I think that is wise, Elinor said quietly. I do not wish to spend whatever time remains to us dwelling upon her cruelty. I would rather focus on rebuilding what we might still have together, rather than mourning what her actions cost us. Alaric stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression grave and tender in equal measure. "Does that mean," he asked carefully, "that you are prepared to consider a future together, Elinor? I do not wish to press you before you are ready, but I find myself hoping, with each passing week, that you might be willing to grant me the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust once more." Elinor studied his familiar face in the soft afternoon light, weighing the question with the same careful consideration she had brought to every aspect of their renewed acquaintance. She thought of the 10 years of grief she had carried, grief that had ultimately been built upon a foundation of lies rather than genuine rejection. She thought of the quiet, steady warmth that had grown between them over these past weeks, evidence that whatever they had once shared had survived, however dormant, beneath the surface of a decade's separation. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I am prepared to consider it, though I hope you understand that trust, once broken so severely, cannot be fully restored overnight, however innocent the circumstances that broke it." "I understand completely," Alaric said, relief evident in his voice. "I do not expect instant trust, Elinor. I only hope for the chance to earn it back, slowly and honestly, for as long as it takes." Their courtship continued through the following months, growing steadily in warmth and confidence as old wounds gradually began to heal. Elinor's family, chastened by the events of the ball and Elinor's own quiet insistence upon respect, treated her with a warmth and consideration she had rarely known within her own household. Margaret and Charlotte, in particular, seemed genuinely eager to make amends for years of careless cruelty, frequently visiting to inquire after Elinor's happiness rather than her marital prospects, a distinction Elinor noticed and appreciated deeply. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 6 months after that fateful evening at Dunhollow Hall, that Alaric formally requested a private audience with Elinor's father regarding his intentions. Elinor waited anxiously in the sitting room while the two men conferred in her father's small study, her hands twisted nervously in her lap, despite her efforts to remain composed. When Alaric emerged from the study some time later, his expression carried a warmth and joy that Elinor had not seen since their earliest days of courtship a decade before. He crossed the room directly to where she sat, and to her considerable surprise, lowered himself onto one knee before her, drawing a small velvet box from within his coat. "Elinor Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the same earnest sincerity she remembered from their youth, though tempered now by years of hard-won wisdom and genuine devotion. 10 years ago, circumstances beyond either of our control robbed us of a future we both believed we would share. I have spent these past months trying, in whatever small ways I could, to earn back the trust that was so cruelly stolen from us both. I do not deserve a second chance at happiness with you, given how thoroughly I failed to seek you out sooner. But I find myself asking regardless, because I cannot imagine facing the remainder of my life without you beside me. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Elinor felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried none of the grief and pain that had marked so many of her tears over the preceding decade. She looked down at the man kneeling before her, the same gray eyes that had once promised her a future in a sunlit orchard now offering that same promise once more, tempered by years of hardship, and finally, blessedly, honesty. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alaric. I will marry you." The joy that spread across his face as he rose to slip the ring onto her finger was matched only by the joy blooming within Elinor's own heart, a happiness she had long believed herself unworthy of experiencing, now finally, fully hers to claim. News of their engagement spread quickly through the county, and Alina found herself, for the first time in her adult life, the subject of genuine celebration rather than pity or mockery. Her mother wept openly with joy, already planning the wedding with an enthusiasm that rivaled her earlier eagerness over the season's various balls. Margaret, Charlotte, and Louisa embraced their eldest sister with what appeared to be entirely genuine happiness, free at last of the jealousy and casual cruelty that had characterized so much of their earlier relationship. "I am so happy for you, Alina," Charlotte said, embracing her warmly on the day the engagement was formally announced. "And I am sorry, truly sorry, for every unkind word I ever spoke toward you over the years. You deserved so much better from your own sisters." "We are learning better now," Alina said gently, returning the embrace with genuine warmth. "That is what matters most going forward." Grace, too, visited soon after the announcement, embracing Alina with tears of genuine joy shining in her eyes. "I always believed there was hope for you both," she said, "even during the darkest years when you refused to speak of him at all. I am so glad to see you finally claiming the happiness you have always deserved." The wedding took place the following spring, in the same orchard where Alina and Alaric had first fallen in love a decade before, the apple blossoms once again in full bloom as they exchanged their vows before family and friends. Alina wore a gown of soft ivory silk, far grander than the plain gray dress she had worn to that fateful ball, though she found she treasured the memory of that simpler gown all the more, knowing it had been present for the moment everything had begun to change. As she stood beside Alaric beneath the blossoming trees, surrounded by a family finally healed of its old cruelties, and a love finally restored after a decade of undeserved separation, Alina thought back over the long, difficult years that had led her to this moment. She thought of every mocking word, every pitying glance, every quiet evening spent believing herself unworthy of the happiness now blooming so fully within her heart. She understood now, with a clarity that only such hard-won experience could offer, that her worth had never depended upon her marital status, nor upon anyone else's recognition of her value. She had been worthy all along, through every lonely year of waiting, through every cruel word her family had once spoken so carelessly. The love she and Alaric now shared was not proof of that worth, but simply a beautiful, hard-won addition to a life she had already learned to build with quiet strength and dignity, regardless of whether any duke ever crossed a ballroom to find her. As the ceremony concluded, and the assembled guests erupted into joyful celebration, Alaric leaned close to whisper softly against her ear, his voice carrying all the warmth and devotion of a decade's restored love. "I promised you once, beneath these very trees, that nothing would keep me from returning to you," he said. "It took far longer than either of us ever intended, and I know the years we lost can never fully be reclaimed. But I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for every single day we spent apart." Alina smiled up at him, her heart finally, fully at peace after a decade of carefully guarded grief. "Then let us begin," she said softly, "exactly here, exactly now." And beneath the soft, drifting petals of the apple blossoms, surrounded by a family transformed and a love finally restored, Alina Ashworth, now Duchess of Dunhollow, stepped forward into the new chapter of a life she had once believed she would never know, no longer the mocked and overlooked elder sister, but a woman who had finally claimed the happiness and respect she had always, quietly deserved. Life at Dunhollow Hall settled into a rhythm quite different from anything Alina had known before. As Duchess, she found herself responsible for a household far grander than anything she had managed in her father's modest home, yet she approached the role with the same steady, practical competence that had once made her indispensable to her own family, even when they failed to appreciate it. She spent her mornings reviewing household accounts alongside the estate's steward, her afternoons visiting tenant families and overseeing improvements to cottages that had long fallen into disrepair, and her evenings in quiet companionship with Alaric, discussing matters of the estate or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of two people who had finally found their way back to one another. It was nearly a year into their marriage when an unexpected letter arrived at Dunhollow Hall, addressed in a hand Alina did not recognize. She opened it in the privacy of her sitting room and felt her breath catch as she read the signature at its close. Beatrice Vane, now Beatrice Hartley, had written to express her deep and genuine remorse for the cruelty she had inflicted upon them both a decade earlier. The letter was lengthy and painfully honest. Beatrice explained, with evident shame, how fear for her family's survival had driven her to such desperate measures, how she had convinced herself at the time that she was acting for the family's greater good, and how the weight of what she had done had haunted her every year since, growing heavier rather than lighter with the passage of time. She did not ask for forgiveness, she wrote, only for the chance to offer her sincere apology, understanding fully that she had no right to expect anything in return. Alina sat with the letter for a long while before showing it to Alaric that evening. He read it in silence, his expression difficult to interpret, and when he finished, he set it down carefully upon the table between them. "What do you wish to do?" he asked quietly. "I will support whatever you decide." Alina considered the question seriously, drawing upon the same quiet strength that had carried her through so much over the past year. "I think," she said slowly, "that carrying anger toward her for the remainder of our lives would only continue the harm she began, allowing her cruelty to shape our happiness even now, years after the fact. I do not believe I owe her friendship, nor even forgiveness in the fullest sense. But I think I am willing to acknowledge her apology, and to let go of whatever bitterness remains, for my own peace as much as anything else." Alaric nodded slowly, clearly moved by her measured response. "You have always possessed a generosity of spirit I have long admired," he said softly, "even when it was least deserved by those around you." Alina wrote a brief, careful reply to Beatrice, acknowledging the apology without extending an invitation to renewed acquaintance, and found, in the weeks that followed, that setting down the last remnants of her old anger brought a lightness to her heart she had not expected. She understood now that true peace required not forgetting what had happened, but simply refusing to let it continue governing her present happiness. As the months passed, Alina found herself drawn increasingly toward the plight of other women within the county who found themselves unmarried past the age society deemed acceptable, women subjected to the same casual cruelty and dismissive pity she herself had endured for so many years. She began hosting quiet gatherings at Dunhollow Hall, initially small teas that gradually grew into something more substantial, a space where unmarried women of the county could gather without judgment, could speak openly of their circumstances and ambitions without fear of ridicule. "You are building quite a reputation," Alaric observed one evening, amusement evident in his voice, as they discussed the growing popularity of Alina's gatherings. "The Duchess of Dunhollow, champion of unmarried women everywhere." "Someone must speak for them," Alina replied, though a small smile touched her lips at his teasing tone. "I know too well how it feels to be dismissed, to be treated as though one's worth depends entirely upon securing a husband. If my position allows me to offer even a small measure of comfort or advocacy to other women facing similar treatment, I consider it a worthy use of my time." Grace, who had remained Alina's closest confidant throughout the years, often assisted with these gatherings, and the two friends took particular satisfaction in watching young women arrive anxious and defensive, only to leave with renewed confidence and a sense of community they had not previously known. Alina's relationship with her own sisters continued to strengthen throughout this period as well. Margaret, Charlotte, and Louisa visited Dunhollow Hall regularly, and Alina watched with quiet satisfaction as each of them gradually shed the casual cruelty that had once characterized their treatment of her, replaced instead by genuine warmth and mutual respect. When Charlotte's own daughter reached an age where marriage prospects became a frequent topic of family conversation, Alina was gratified to hear her sister firmly discourage any unkind speculation about the girl's future, insisting instead that her daughter's worth would never depend upon whether or when she chose to marry. "You taught me that lesson," Charlotte admitted to Alina one afternoon, watching her young daughter play in the gardens of Dunhollow Hall. Though I am ashamed it took me so many years, and so much unkindness on my part, before I truly understood it. It was nearly 2 years after their wedding when Alina discovered she was carrying their first child, news that brought both her and Alaric a joy so profound that Alina found herself, for the first time in her adult life, entirely without words to describe her happiness. Alaric, ever composed and measured in his public demeanor, could not contain his delight, insisting on personally overseeing every preparation for the nursery and fussing over Alina's comfort with an attentiveness that both touched and amused her. Their daughter was born on a bright spring morning, nearly exactly 2 years after their wedding beneath the blossoming apple trees, and Alina held the small, precious bundle in her arms with tears of overwhelming joy streaming freely down her cheeks. They named her Grace, in honor of the friend whose steady loyalty had carried Alina through her darkest years, and whose gentle encouragement had ultimately given her the courage to hope again. As Alina sat by the nursery window some weeks later, cradling her infant daughter and watching Alaric move about the room with the same tender attentiveness he had shown throughout her pregnancy, she found herself reflecting upon the long, winding path that had led her to this moment of complete and unguarded happiness. She thought of the 18-year-old girl who had once walked through an orchard full of hope and promise, and of the devastated young woman who had spent a decade believing herself unwanted and unworthy of love. She thought of every cruel word her family had once spoken, every pitying glance from relations who assumed her unmarried state reflected some fundamental flaw within her character. She understood now, holding her daughter close and watching the man she loved move gently about their nursery, that every difficult year of her past had shaped her into a woman of remarkable strength and quiet dignity, qualities that had ultimately allowed her to build a life of genuine happiness once the truth finally emerged from beneath a decade of cruel deception. "What are you thinking of?" Alaric asked softly, settling beside her and reaching out to gently touch their daughter's small hand. "I am thinking," Alina said, smiling up at him, "of how grateful I am that you crossed that ballroom all those months ago, rather than allowing pride or fear to keep you at a distance." "I very nearly did not," Alaric admitted quietly. "I stood at that entrance for what felt like an eternity, wondering whether I had any right to approach you after so many years of silence, wondering whether you would even wish to speak with me at all." "And yet you crossed it regardless," Alina said. "That courage changed everything for both of us." "You are the one who showed true courage that evening," Alaric said gently, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Choosing to trust me again, after everything you had suffered, after everything our family's cruelty and deception had cost you. That took far greater bravery than simply crossing a crowded room." Alina smiled, looking down at their sleeping daughter, and then out through the nursery window toward the distant orchard where their story had first begun, and later found its way back to itself. Whatever challenges the future might hold, she understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she had finally claimed the life and love she had always, quietly and steadfastly, deserved. The mocking words of her sisters, once so painful, had long since faded into distant memory, replaced by a family healed and strengthened through hard-won understanding. The lonely years of quiet grief had given way to a marriage built upon honesty and genuine devotion. And the young woman who had once stood forgotten at the edges of countless ballrooms had finally, fully, found her rightful place at the very center of a life, overflowing with love, purpose, and the deep, abiding peace that comes only from knowing one's own worth beyond any doubt.